Welcome to Clinical Conversations. I'm Joe Elia. This week's interview is about Me Too in the OR. But before that, the week's top stories from Physicians First Watch, read by its editor, Amy Herman.
Hi, everyone. Once again, novel coronavirus dominated our news this week. Cases soared in China and appeared across the globe. The World Health Organization declared a public health emergency of international concern, and the United States reported its first case of person-to-person transmission. As of Thursday, the WHO reported over 7,800 cases worldwide, mostly in China, but also in 18 other countries. Next, a study finds that isolated diastolic hypertension using a blood pressure cutoff of 80 millimeters of mercury is not associated with adverse cardiovascular outcomes. 80 is the stricter cutoff imposed by the American College of Cardiology and the American Heart Association in 2017. Earlier guidelines recommended a cutoff of 90. Elsewhere, getting a positive result on exercise stress ECG and a normal result on stress echocardiography might portend increased risk for adverse cardiovascular events. During a 7-year study, patients with a positive ECG and a negative echo were more likely to have a major cardiovascular event than those with negative results on both tests. And finally, a study suggests that Black barbershops could be a novel locale for diagnosing diabetes that might otherwise get missed. Of men in Black barbershops in Brooklyn who agreed to have their blood glucose measured, 9% screened positive for diabetes, and 28% had pre-diabetes. And that's it for this week. Stick around for Joe Elia's latest clinical conversation.
The journal Narrative Inquiry in Bioethics has just published its latest issue titled #MeToo in Surgery, Narratives by Women Surgeons. And we have a conversation with Dr. Pringl Miller, who assembled and introduces the symposium. It features, in her words, 12 very brave and intimate narratives about the challenges associated with becoming a surgeon and practicing surgery as a woman. Dr. Miller practices emergency general surgery and hospice and palliative medicine. She is also a senior fellow at the University of Chicago's McLean Center for Clinical Medical Ethics. Welcome to Clinical Conversations, Dr. Miller.
Thank you very much, Joe.
Those are indeed some very brave narratives. How did the symposium come about?
Interestingly enough, through a conversation with a person that I encountered through the American College of Surgeons communities. Her name is Dr. Paula Muto, and she and I were discussing our history in surgery and came to the conclusion that we'd had some very similar experiences sort of centered around discriminatory behaviors, microaggressions, and that sort of thing. And we started wondering whether that was more of a pervasive experience with women practicing surgery. And so we just began to network with other colleagues and unfortunately determined that we were not alone. And then I decided that these experiences really needed to be made public. So through that realization, approached the editors at the Narrative Inquiry and Bioethics about a symposium, which they do, I believe, on a quarterly basis. They have a themed symposium. And so I pitched that topic to them.
Oh, I see. Well, full disclosure, I know Dr. Paula Muto, who cares for my mother's leg ulcer in a clinic, and that's how I heard about you. But she didn't say that she had anything to do with putting together the narrative. I'm glad that she did, though. So the demographics of medicine are really changing. I mean, they've been changing over the past 30 or 40 years, but apparently not its culture so quickly. What sort of sea change do you think will it take to transform the medical surgical culture?
It's an excellent question. A lot of people are putting their heads at answers to that question right now. I think part of it is just going to be a cultural, ethical shift in the realization that there isn't equity. Medicine has been primarily a male-dominated field, and it's a hierarchical profession, and the power structure is designed in a way that there really isn't an ability for people to have equity across gender, across race, across professional development timeframes. And so until that sort of power structure is rethought, I don't know that we're going to achieve true equity. It's interesting because the number of women entering into medical school now has reached 50% or 51%, but that equity in numbers has not translated to equity in experience. And one of my collaborators and one of the contributors to the Narrative Inquiry Symposium is in gynecologic surgery, and that's a surgical service that is now really 80% women. And despite that dynamic of having the critical mass, they're still seeing that within power and leadership positions, mostly held by men, there's still challenges with gender discrimination and equity. So it's not just numbers. It's really going to have to be more about systemic changes. And
people often refer to the old guard, or when I hear these stories, I hear about, this old surgeon was, acted this or that way. But one of the writers in the symposium, she wrote anonymously, said that harassment is coming from her peers and not necessarily the old guard. That was a surprise.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That behavior hasn't improved with the changing of the generations.
I don't know if I'm so surprised about that, just because leadership style and leadership priorities trickle down. And the NEJM report, the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medicine, makes it really clear that when you're functioning within a male-dominated field, I don't know that it's a generational, there's just an acceptance for certain types of behaviors. And unfortunately, I would say misogyny that kind of permeates through. I'm not saying that it's just a male against female dynamic, because there are, men who are treated poorly and there are women who treat other women poorly. But I think the overarching sort of competitiveness and hierarchical structure does unfortunately allow for individuals to not be supported in being treated badly just for fear of their own development and success.
Yes, that's a trap that the abused fall into. If they report the bad behavior, then they're often subject to the evaluation of the perpetrator. And so they are left to choose between a career that they've spent their youth preparing for and the possibility, and it's only a possibility, of bringing the perpetrator to justice. And one of the things and speaking of male domination, one of the comments that struck me was, and I'm quoting, "I think full-blown PTSD was an excellent way to go through surgical training. Hypervigilance, insomnia, and anger were advantages in my testosterone-driven training program." Now, one of the commenters says, "Well, this was kind of spoken tongue in cheek." I'm not sure that it was.
No, I think there's a certain amount of fury that people adapt to that anger of that survival mechanism of, I'm not going to let someone else kind of interfere with what I'm trying to achieve here. And it's a motivator. And it's really, one of the things that I commend my female colleagues for is just the amount of resilience that they've had to come up with to endure the training process and then endure a lot of the challenges that persist into practice. And I guess one of the things that I thought myself as a naive individual going through training was that I think everybody understood that surgical training was going to be arduous and difficult and wearing, but I didn't anticipate that once I was done with that training, that it would just continue.
Yeah. The New England Journal of Medicine recently published an article detailing the extent of abuse and harassment in surgical residency training. Up to two-thirds of residents in some programs reported verbal abuse. Roughly 20% of women reported sexual harassment. Why are people getting away with this sort of behavior?
It's a good question, and I think that some of the answers lie within institutional priorities and the lack of institutional oversight and accountability. So I think when somebody is a known researcher, somebody is known for their clinical acumen, they're bringing in money to the institution, it's prestigious, they're protected. And so the response to something like that, and we see this, and there have been more and more articles coming out about this sort of phenomenon of pass the trash, that if an institution decides that they can't hold on to someone who's been accused of harassment or other indecencies, they will let them go, but then another institution will pick them up. So there isn't an accountability within institutions to hold people accountable for this bad behavior. And in fact, what I see over and over again is that often women who report it become the targets. So they're the ones that actually lose their jobs. They're the ones that lose their opportunities. It's not the person who is the perpetrator.
So let's move away from the facts of the abuse to addressing the solution. Are there organizations that people can turn to that are not going to put them in the uncomfortable position of reporting the people who are going to be reporting on them?
Well, I'm going to bring that back to the infrastructure of the supposed support systems within institutions, HR, for example, or diversity, inclusion, and equity leaders or Title IX leaders. I'm not sure that those individuals universally are doing their jobs to protect those that are victimized. Again, it gets back to the greater institutional priorities of who they're going to value and who they're going to protect. Outside of the institution, Time's Up Healthcare, I'm glad you brought that up, is a foundation that is really working hard to partner with signatories and other institutions of higher learning, so academic institutions, healthcare systems, to help them think about how to make their work environment safer, more equitable, and more dignified for women who are working in healthcare. And that's not just for physicians, that's for all women working within healthcare, because as we know, about 80% of the healthcare workforce are women. So I think these outside foundations are working to try to help assist the institutions create a better culture. And I think ultimately what we're heading towards is some kind of grading system, scorecard, something, like a Press Ganey that has to do with really looking under the hood to see how they're managing these sorts of behaviors. Could I just interject one thing also, though? And that has to do with this tolerance idea, which is interesting because in talking to other colleagues that are part of Time's Up Healthcare and signatories, I think until we actually do establish a zero tolerance policy for these behaviors, there's still going to be a certain amount of wiggle room. And I know that some institutions have been leery to sign up for a zero tolerance because it's really hard to have control over that. But I think the ideology needs to be really that there is going to be a zero tolerance.
Are there other narratives beyond what's just been published that are instructive for people? I will put the URL for yours in the website. And by the way, if people want to order it, it's $20 right now. But are you aware of books or other narratives about this?
So I am aware of a couple of books. Dr. Patricia Dawson, who was one of the commentary authors, she wrote a book many years ago, really sort of at the cusp of when women of color became surgical trainees. And that is a compendium of her interviewing women of color that were surgical residents at the time. That's called Forged by the Knife.
Okay.
And then there's another book by Preeti John Dr. John also was one of the contributors. Her narrative is online. So just to make it clear, there were 12 narratives that were selected for the print edition, and then a total of 19, 7 more narratives that are online.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So Dr. P.D. John's narrative is online, and she has also written a book. So her book is called Being a Woman Surgeon, 60 Women Share Their Stories.
So I will put a link to it.
Okay.
On our website.
There's also a book, the first book that I'm aware of that came out about women surgeons, which was by Joan Cassell, and that's called The Surgeon in a Woman's Body.
I will link to that as well. And finally, I want to ask you, Dr. Miller, what are the lessons that you hope the typical listener to this podcast will take away? And it's kind of like asking an obvious question. And I guess the answer would be behave if you're a man and be brave if you're a woman, but something has to go beyond that.
I'd like the people who listen to understand the strength and the sacrifice and the commitment that women in surgery take on when they make that decision. And I think one of the things that is not really well known is what goes on behind the scenes. The women who experience training in surgery and practice in surgery are so strong that they're enduring these things without it really being known. And they're doing it in a way that shows a lot of grace and resilience, and they're still able to take care of patients very effectively and very competently. But it's at a cost. And I think that our society needs to understand that cost is going to catch up. And as we enter into a time when a physician shortage is a threat, a surgeon shortage is a threat, and we need to make sure that our workforce is healthy, we need to start addressing these issues, because I don't think that we can continue to have a workforce that is under such duress doing such important things for such important work for patients. There's going to be a tipping point or a breaking point, and I don't want to see it come to that.
I want to thank you very much, Dr. Miller, for talking with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much, Joe.
That was our 250th episode. All of them are available free at podcasts.jwatch.org. We come to you from NEJM Journal Watch and the NEJM Group. The executive producer is Kristen Kelly, and I'm Joe Elia. Thank you for listening.